Kawere, welcome to Born Extinct, my journey to the acknowledgement of my ancestors and authentic spiritual self. My name is Atakwa, and I was born extinct. Krotoa, Pochahontas, and Malinche. The stories of these three indigenous girls are buried in the graveyards of myth and fantasy. Their lives were filled with trauma, including gang rape, flogging, manipulation, slave labor, and betrayal from the age of 11 or 12. They were baptized, a way of removing indigenous identity in preparation for subservience to the invader, forcing them to adhere to whatever was defined as European civilization. Compliments attributed to these children are often darkened by stereotypical views, from cute little noble savages to sexually promiscuous deviants. The notion that they were dying ancient cultures and people, too weak and doomed for extinction, saved by the arrival of civilization, became a nostalgic, romantic view for the European settler. The noble status of Krotoa, Pochahontas, and Malinche as girl children of chiefs of the wealthy and powerful indigenous nations created for them interactions with powerful colonial slave masters. Caught between the fragile relationship of the invader and indigenous people, Krotoa, Pochahontas, and Malinche were the victims of hypersexualization and extreme forms of indoctrination and abuse. In the colonial narrative, the writer portrays the European as a god, and that these oversexed, opportunistic, European status-seeking indigenous children would seduce them and fall in love with them. Christian historians, on the other hand, view the stories of these three children as ones of rapid moral decline, as stories of how the invader tried but failed to tame the savage. These three indigenous children had similar experiences. They were born in different periods, completely different regions, and enslaved by invaders from Spain, Holland, and England. They were known to have betrayed their race and their people. Since these girls were daughters of noblemen, they had higher than average education and were able to leverage that in their negotiations, albeit forced involvement. John Rolfe and Pochahontas, Pieter van Meerhof and Krotoa, and Hernam, Cortes, and Malinche's mixed marriages provided metaphoric models for the blending of indigenous and colonial cultures and symbolized the possibility of racial harmony. Both Pochahontas, Malinche, and Krotoa were eventually viewed as traitors to their people. They were, however, the ultimate pawns in the struggle between invader and indigenous people. Enslaved wives and concubines, such as these captive children, knew that their arrangements were irregular and that their positions were frowned upon by society. Always treated as outsiders, their own children were often enslaved by their husbands, who were also their slave masters. There were no laws for them. The matters of abuse was considered domestic matters. These girls were compromised interpreters, liaisons, guides into territories unknown to the European. They also advised on indigenous customs, protocols, and beliefs. The narrative of these young children collaborating with the enemy and turning their backs on the people, on their own people, is a spectacular European lie. The Disney movie of Pocahontas of 1995 does not provide a clue of how her father led 25,000 men against the English invader. In 2017, a dramatization of Krotoa's life was turned into a feature film. In this penguin movie by Roberta Durant, she portrayed the sexual exploitation, rape, and degradation of the child Krotoa as a love story. Until just recently, a Netflix series, Malinche was constantly portrayed as a person who facilitated the raids and massacres against their people, killing millions and topping the Extict empire of Maya. Our children are still taught history that obscures and demonizes indigenous people. Their stories of sexual abuse and kidnapping is erased by the historians, Disney and other storytellers. The parts where these children were then rejected by the communities and settler communities are erased. The colonization of black bodies using sex as a tool for subordination, humiliating men in the process, spreading the seeds in preparation for taking of the lands are largely ignored when reparations are discussed. The New World was built on labor, bodies, and sexual exploitation of indigenous women and children. The fetishization of indigenous women and girl children is ongoing and sinister. The kind of feel-good story makes the invader to the New World feel good about their history and convinces them that the genocides were harmless. Because even the cream of indigenous royalty found the European irresistible. Pocahontas was born in 1595 as Amanut. Her family name was Matoaka, meaning flowers between two streams. Her nickname, meaning playful child, was Pochahontas. Her father, Powhatan, also known as Wasaneka, was the formidable paramount chief of the Powhatan Empire of more than 30 nations. Their land is what is today called Jamestown, Virginia. He had several wives living in several villages. Pocahontas had many brothers and sisters in many villages. The English arrived in Jamestown in 1607. For 2 years, her father, the paramount chief, traded food with the starving settlers. Pocahontas, with their incredible language skills, was allowed to go along on these long and painful trips. She learned to speak English during these interactions. Her father trusted her in her adolescence to act as diplomat between the newcomers until she was abducted by Captain Samuel Argall in 1613 and was taken by boat and held in Jamestown. When indigenous people realized that these Europeans were planning to stay, they wanted the invader off their land and started withholding food trade. This infuriated the invader and they started showing their brutality and genocidal tendencies. Captain Argall originally kidnapped Pocahontas to trade her for tools, food, corn, and for Englishmen held by her father, but soon realized that she made a very effective bargaining tool, and she became a slave. She was already married and had a child to Kakum, a warrior from the Potawatomi nation, when she was married off to John Rolfe, a tobacco planter, in 1614. At the age of 19, she had a second child called Thomas. After she was kidnapped, she was never allowed to see her father, her firstborn, and her siblings again. At the time before the marriage, John Rolfe was under pressure to make his stolen tobacco plantation profitable and hoped that a marriage to Pocahontas would give him that security. Tobacco curing techniques is a sacred practice to indigenous Americans and could not be shared with outsiders. After he married her, Rolfe became a wealthy man. Despite the genocide of her people in the backdrop by the British invader, the false narrative goes that this good Indian admired the invader and his Christianity so much that she was prepared to absorb his culture, live with them, marry one of them instead of one of her own. Pocahontas was baptized Rebecca and left for England with John Rolfe and her kidnapper Samuel Argyle in 1616. After a year in this hostile country where she was exhibited and paraded to prove that natives could be domesticated, she died at the age of 30. Malinche, or Malinali, meaning twisted grass, has become a name for treachery and betrayal in Mexico, a national Judas. Malinche, also known as Donna Marina or Malantzin, was born in Painala, a Mayan city, in 1500 and died in 1529 on the Mexican Gulf Coast. Her father was the chief of the Nahuatl speakers. She was used as a multilingual interpreter, cultural advisor, and negotiator for the Spanish invader. Herman Cortes, during the invasion of the Aztec Empire between 1519 and 1521, used her to negotiate the terms. This period is known as Mexico's Conquista, when Cortes led an onslaught against the Mexican people, killing millions and forcibly assimilating the survivors. After the death of her father, her mother married another nobleman. She was given to a member of another clan. Then she was stolen and sold into slavery. She was then resold to the chief of Tabasco, who gave her as one of 20 girls to the 34-year-old Cortes in 1519, after the defeat of Tabasco at the city of Tabasco. Cortes first gifted her to one of his captains, Alonso Hernandez Pontocarrera. When he realized that she had the command of many Mayan languages as well as Spanish, he took her back. Because of her above-average intellect, she was favored by slave masters, and she exchanged hands multiple times over a period of 10 years. She spoke Nahuatl and many Mayan languages. Hernan Cortes was already married to a Spanish woman. She was baptized, as was custom for all concubines, and given the name Marina. She had a child with Cortes called Martin Cortes in 1522. He received a title of knighthood of Santiago. He is the first recorded mestizo in the New World. After some years, during the failed capture of Honduras, Cortes gave her to one of his men, Jean Jaramillo. He married her and she had a daughter called Maria. She died in Mexico City in 1529. European narrative has romanticized her role in the various land invasions of Cortes, and Malinche is now seen as the ultimate villain of Mexican history. It is only after Mexico gained independence from Spain that she was cast in novels and films as an evil being. The story of Malinche and Cortes is portrayed by the Catholic Church as Mexican Adam and Eve. Mexicans have dubbed her an ethnic traitress. On the night of 6 April 1652, the moon was full. The Goringaikwa, Goringhaitrona, Chochokwa, and other groups of the trading station at the Cape, part of a large kraal, were having their full moon ceremony, joining hundreds and thousands of people all over the world doing the same. The moon is symbolic to many nations all over the world. They watch through the mist, as they and their ancestors have done for close to 200 years, since the arrival of the Chinese ships in 1421, as a fleet of ships arrived. The next morning, on the 7th, a few men were sent ashore. There are no records of these discussions. In 1652, the bay was already quite cosmopolitan, with multiples of language being spoken. The ships were given permission to dock at this thriving market. It was only on the 8th that everyone was allowed to land. Traders and interpreters were on hand, and so was Krotoa, the niece of Oud-Shomato. They were given permission to set up their tents in the kraal. Jan van Riebeeck arrived in the Cape with 200 men, his wife Maria de la Quellerie, his sister, and 2 female cousins. This was the day when peace and tranquility was shattered in this beautiful land, and this land was contaminated with greed, rape, and murder. This marked the first day of savagery and barbarism, multiple genocides and massacres, slavery and rape on this unspoiled indigenous land. The hospitality would usher in the permanence of suffering and degradation and bloodshed of the first people of Southern Africa. By 1657, there were an additional 4 slave women in the Dutch military camp in the kraal of the Khoi, and Van Riebeeck started sabotaging the Khoi's access to passing ships and trading Khoi goods directly. The European passing through the Cape had an obsession with kidnapping Khoi girl children. This adventurous, free-spirited Krotoa, with the command of English, Portuguese, French, and Dutch languages, quickly caught the eye of Jan van Riebeeck. Join me next week for part 2 of Krotoa and slavery of indigenous children. Kai Gangangs for your time. Cape of Storms, Falls Bay, Table Bay, Cape of Good Hope, Settler, it was not yours to take. My name is Atakwa, and I was born extinct.